A struggling waitress hands Barron Trump a simple glass of water, unaware that her life is about to change forever. When he unexpectedly leaves behind a mysterious envelope, her hands tremble as she opens it, revealing a $10,000 check. But why did he do it? The truth behind his generosity will leave you speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain drizzled steadily onto the neon-lit streets, casting shimmering reflections on the pavement as cars passed by in the late evening gloom. The small diner at the corner, a modest yet welcoming place, buzzed with the usual mix of regulars and weary travelers seeking a warm meal and a moment's peace. Inside, Sarah, a young waitress in her early 20s, moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups with a practiced ease that masked the exhaustion she felt. Every night was the same: long hours, aching feet, and barely enough tips to make rent, let alone pay for her mother's growing medical expenses. But tonight, something felt different. The soft jingle of the doorbell barely registered in Sarah's mind as she finished taking an order. However, when she turned toward the entrance, her breath caught in her throat. A tall young man had entered, his striking features unmistakable. Barron Trump. Even in his casual attire, there was no mistaking him. The son of one of the most famous men in the world stood there, seemingly hesitant, his gaze scanning the room as if unsure of where he belonged. He was alone. No entourage, no security detail visible, just him and the weight of whatever had brought him here. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to move. Why was he here? Of all places, why this small, tucked-away diner? She stole another glance at him as he walked toward the farthest booth, away from the main crowd, his movements slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. There was something in the way he carried himself that contradicted the public image she had seen on television. A quiet heaviness, as if he carried an unseen burden. Drawing a deep breath, she grabbed her notepad and made her way toward his table, her fingers tightening slightly around the pen. She couldn't shake the odd feeling in the air, as if something important was about to unfold. What do you even say to someone like him? Her mind raced for the right words, but when she finally reached him, instinct took over. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite the curiosity gnawing at her. "Can I get you something to drink?" Barron looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. His expression was polite but unreadable, his deep blue gaze holding an intensity she hadn't expected. "Just water, please," he said quietly. It was such a simple request, but the way he said it, softly, almost hesitantly, made her pause. There was something different about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Sarah nodded and turned away, her mind spinning. As she walked back to the counter, she couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just another customer, another transaction. Barron Trump had walked into her life tonight for a reason, and though she didn't know it yet, this encounter would change both of their lives forever. Sarah placed the glass of water on the table in front of Barron, her hands steady despite the unshakable curiosity stirring inside her. She had served hundreds of customers in her time at the diner, some rude, some kind, and some indifferent, but none had ever felt as out of place as he did. There was something unusual about him tonight, something beyond his famous last name. He didn't radiate the arrogance or entitlement she expected from someone raised in the spotlight. Instead, he seemed almost lost. She hesitated for a second, waiting to see if he would say something more, but Barron simply nodded his thanks before turning his gaze back to the window, watching the rain as it dribbled down the glass. His fingers idly tapped against the tabletop, the only sign of his unease. Sarah lingered a moment longer than necessary before finally pulling away, her curiosity growing. Why would someone like him come here, alone, on a rainy night? This wasn't a place where celebrities or public figures came for a meal. It was just an old diner with flickering lights and a leaky roof. As she went about her routine, refilling coffee cups and taking orders, she found herself stealing glances at Barron's table. He hadn't touched the water, nor had he made any effort to order food. Instead, he sat still, staring at something unseen. his mind clearly elsewhere. Finally, the dinner rush slowed, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered across the booths. Sarah took a deep breath and, before she could second-guess herself, made her way back to Barron's table. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked cautiously, trying to make sense of why he was sitting there alone. Barron looked up, startled by her question. For a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even loneliness. "No," he said after a pause. "I just needed to get away for a while." Sarah frowned, his response only deepening the mystery. "Away from what?" He exhaled, as if debating whether to answer. Then, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he shrugged. "Everything." Sarah studied him carefully. She had always imagined people like Barron Trump lived a life free from the struggles that weighed on everyday people. But sitting here, watching the way he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, it was clear that money and fame didn't protect someone from feeling lost. "Well," she said, trying to lighten the mood, "you came to the right place if you wanted to disappear for a bit. Nobody here cares much about politics or headlines, just coffee, cheap food, and whether the jukebox works." Barron chuckled softly, the first real sign of warmth she had seen from him all evening. "Sounds nice," he admitted. Encouraged by the break in tension, Sarah took a step closer, crossing her arms. "So, what are you really doing here? You don't exactly look like the type who walks into random diners alone." Barron tapped his fingers against the table, considering his words. I just wanted to be somewhere normal for once." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And normal to you is sitting in a rundown diner in the middle of a rainstorm?" Barron laughed, shaking his head. "It's quieter than the life I'm used to." Sarah thought about that for a moment. She had always assumed that people in Barron's position had it easy. But now, looking at him, she wasn't so sure. There was a weight on his shoulders, something invisible but heavy nonetheless. "I guess I can understand that," she admitted. "Life can be overwhelming sometimes." Barron glanced up at her, his expression softening. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it really can." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The diner hummed with the quiet sounds of low conversations and the occasional clatter of dishes, but between them, there was only silence. Finally, Sarah broke the moment, sensing that whatever had driven Barron here wasn't something he was ready to share. "Well, if you decide you actually want to eat, let me know," she said with a small smile. Barron nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile of his own. "I will." As she walked away, Sarah felt something stir deep in her chest, an odd sense that this night was far from over, that whatever had led Barron Trump into this little diner was bigger than a simple desire for solitude. And for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be part of it. The rain continued to tap against the windows of the diner as the night stretched on, casting a rhythmic hum over the now quiet space. Sarah moved through the aisles, refilling coffee mugs and clearing empty plates, but her mind kept drifting back to the young man sitting alone in the farthest booth. Barron Trump, one of the most recognizable names in the country, sitting in a small-town diner like a lost traveler who had nowhere else to go. Even though she had waited on plenty of customers who preferred to keep to themselves, something about Barron's presence tonight unsettled her. It wasn't just that he was out of place. It was the way he seemed disconnected from the world around him, as if he were trapped inside his own thoughts, weighed down by something invisible but overwhelming. Finally, as she approached his table again, she noticed he had a notebook in front of him, its pages filled with slanted handwriting. He was scribbling something furiously, his brow furrowed in deep thought. This wasn't just a casual visit. He was here for a reason. "You write?" she asked, surprising even herself with the bluntness of the question. Barron looked up, startled, before glancing down at his notebook. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly when I can't figure out what I'm feeling." Sarah leaned slightly against the counter, intrigued. "So, what are you trying to figure out tonight?" Barron exhaled through his nose, a half smile forming on his lips. "That's the problem. I don't even know. Sarah nodded, understanding that feeling all too well. She had spent many nights staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment, trying to make sense of her own life, only to come up with nothing but more questions. "You know," she said after a moment, "most people would kill to have your life, the money, the fame, the connections, and yet you're sitting here like a guy who just lost everything." Barron chuckled dryly, "Because sometimes having everything feels like having nothing." That response hit her harder than she expected. She had assumed that wealth solved problems, that privilege erased struggles, but the way Barron spoke, so genuine, so raw, made her realize just how wrong she had been. She glanced at the notebook again. "What do you write about?" Barron hesitated before flipping to a fresh page. He tapped his pen against the table, contemplating his words. "I guess I write about the things I can't say out loud." Sarah tilted her head. "Like what?" Barron sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Like what it feels like to be seen by everyone but known by no one. Like what it's like to grow up with people deciding who you are before you even get the chance to figure it out yourself." Sarah swallowed hard. She had expected some vague answer, something polite and rehearsed. Instead, she got a glimpse of the weight Barron carried every day, a weight that no amount of money or fame could make lighter. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. Barron let out a quiet laugh. "Yeah," he admitted, "it is." Silence settled between them again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with an unspoken connection between two people who, despite their vastly different lives, knew what it was like to feel isolated. Finally, Sarah reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a pen. "Here," she said, sliding it across the table. "Write about tonight." Barron looked at the pen, then at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Why?" Sarah shrugged. "Because maybe putting it on paper will help you figure out why you came here in the first place." For the first time that night, Barron smiled. A real smile, not the polite one he had given earlier. "You might be right." He took the pen, and as he did, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something important. Maybe this wasn't just a random encounter. Maybe Barron Trump hadn't just stumbled into her diner. Maybe he had been meant to. Sarah left him to his writing and returned to her other duties. But the night felt different now. She found herself stealing glances at Barron as he scribbled in his notebook, his expression shifting between deep focus and occasional flickers of emotion. Whatever he was writing, it was something important, something he had needed to get out for a long time. A few minutes later, a soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me." Sarah turned to find an older woman, one of the regulars, standing near the counter. She glanced toward Barron's table, then back at Sarah. "That boy over there, he looks familiar." Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to say. She knew that if people realized who he was, it could cause a scene, and judging by how quiet and reserved Barron had been tonight, that was the last thing he wanted. "He's just passing through," Sarah said casually, hoping the woman would let it go. The woman nodded slowly but didn't press further. "Well, whoever he is, he looks like he could use a friend." Sarah glanced back at Barron, watching as he continued writing, oblivious to the conversation happening about him. The woman wasn't wrong. He did look like he could use a friend. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Sarah found herself wanting to be that friend. As the night stretched on, the diner emptied out, until it was just Barron and a couple of stragglers nursing their coffee. Sarah wiped down the counter, stealing one last glance at the young man, who had turned her night upside down. Then, just as she was about to turn away, Barron set his pen down and closed his notebook. He looked up at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than before. Sarah frowned. "For what?" Barron hesitated, then gestured around the diner. "For letting me just exist here for a while." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't done much, just talked to him, given him space, but somehow It had mattered. "Any time," she said, and she meant it. Barron nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. Sarah looked down at it, confused. "What's this?" Barron stood up, grabbing his coat. "Just something to say thank you." Before she could ask anything else, he turned and walked toward the door. Sarah stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally picking it up. With a deep breath, she pulled it open, and her heart nearly stopped. Inside was a check for $10,000. Her breath hitched as she read the amount over and over, her hands shaking. She looked up, but Barron was already stepping out into the rain, disappearing into the night, as if he had never been there at all. Sarah sat down hard in the booth, her mind spinning. Why had he done this? Why her? As the rain poured outside, Sarah clutched the check in her trembling hands, knowing one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again. The night after Barron Trump had walked into her diner and left her with a life-altering check, Sarah barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind replayed the moment. The weight of the envelope in her hands, the sight of his retreating figure disappearing into the rain, and the disbelief that had seized her when she saw the amount: $10,000. She had held the check for hours, running her fingers over the ink, rereading her name on it as if it might change. It felt surreal, impossible. By morning, exhaustion and uncertainty gnawed at her. The money could change everything. It could pay off her overdue rent, cover her mother's medical bills, and even allow her to take a break from the grueling double shifts she had been working. And yet, an unfamiliar feeling weighed on her chest. Guilt. Why had Barron chosen her? She wasn't special. She was just another struggling waitress, one of thousands in the city trying to make ends meet. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, just given him a glass of water and talked to him like a normal person. And yet, he had left her with a gift that felt too big, too heavy to accept. Sarah sat in her small apartment, the check still resting on the table, staring at it like it might offer her an answer. She needed to talk to him. But how? Barron Trump wasn't someone she could just call up. She had no way of reaching him, no idea where he was staying, and even if she did, what would she say? Why me? The question haunted her all day as she made her way back to the diner for her evening shift. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the weight of the secret she carried pressing down on her. No one else in the room knew that she was holding a check worth more than half a year's wages in her bag. If they did, would they look at her differently? The hours crawled by as she moved through her routine, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, pretending that everything was normal. But she felt anything but normal. Then, as she wiped down the counter near the end of the night, the bell over the door jingled. Sarah turned, her breath catching in her throat. Barron Trump had just walked in. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps. He glanced around, his gaze landing on her immediately, as if he had been hoping she would be here. For a moment, Sarah just stared at him. She hadn't expected to see him again, not after what had happened the night before. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, looking both calm and uncertain at the same time. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to move. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice casual despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Barron offered a small smile. "I figured I should check in on you." Sarah swallowed hard. "Why?" His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Because I didn't know if I made things better or worse." She exhaled sharply, nodding. "That makes two of us." A beat of silence passed between them before Sarah gestured toward an empty booth. "Sit." Barron hesitated, then obeyed. Sarah slid into the seat across from him, heart pounding. She reached into her bag, pulling out the envelope, and set it between them. "I can't take this," she said. Barron's gaze dropped to the check, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" Sarah let out a shaky laugh. "Because it doesn't make sense. You don't even know me, and yet you did this. You gave me something that could change my life, and I don't understand why." Barron leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the table. "Because I could," he said simply. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of myself." Sarah frowned. "What does that mean?" Barron exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It means that I know what it's like to feel stuck. To work hard every day and still feel like you're running in place. To wonder if anyone sees you, really sees you." His words settled into Sarah's chest, heavy and real. "I don't want you to think this was some charity thing," he continued. "I didn't do it because I felt sorry for you. I did it because you were kind to me when you didn't have to be. Because you talked to me like I was just a normal person." Sarah's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much that had mattered to him. "But $10,000? she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not just a tip. That's a whole new life." Barron gave a small, almost self-conscious shrug. "Money doesn't mean the same thing to me as it does to most people, but I know what it can do for someone who needs it." Sarah stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking, but there was none. He was serious. He had meant every word. A lump formed in her throat. "I don't even know what to say." Barron's lips twitched upward. "Then don't say anything, just do something good with it." Sarah looked down at the check again, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "I don't want to waste it," she murmured. "I don't want to just spend it and forget that this ever happened." Barron tilted his head. "Then don't." She looked up at him, a new kind of determination sparking in her eyes. "What if I used it to help someone else? What if I did something that mattered, the way you just did for me?" Barron's gaze softened. "Then that would be the best thing you could do." Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she made her decision. She would take the money. Not for herself, but for something bigger. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had control over her future. Like she wasn't just surviving, but actually choosing the direction of her life. And it had all started with one quiet night, one unexpected conversation, and one act of pure generosity. As Barron stood to leave, Sarah called after him, "Will I see you again?" He turned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I hope so." Then, with a final nod, he walked out into the night once more, disappearing just as he had the night before. But this time, Sarah wasn't left with just questions. She was left with a purpose. The days that followed Barron's visit to the diner were filled with restless thoughts and a feeling Sarah had never quite experienced before, a deep sense of responsibility. She had made a decision that night, one she could not back away from. The $10,000 he had given her was no longer just a gift, nor was it just an escape from her struggles. It was a chance to create something meaningful. But where did she even begin? Sarah spent hours sitting at her small kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her, the check lying beside it like an unspoken promise. She scribbled ideas down, crossed them out, then rewrote them again. Every plan seemed too big, too small, or too uncertain. It wasn't until she thought back to her own struggles, the nights she had gone to bed hungry, the weeks she had worked double shifts just to pay her mother's medical bills, the times she had watched children walk into the diner, their parents too ashamed to admit they couldn't afford more than a cup of coffee, that she knew exactly what she had to do. She wasn't going to use the money for herself. She was going to start something for the people like her, a community fund, a small initiative to help people in the city who were struggling just to survive, just like she had been. Whether it was paying for a few months of rent for someone on the verge of eviction, helping a single parent put food on the table, or assisting students who couldn't afford their books, she knew exactly how much a small act of kindness could change someone's life. And now she had the chance to be the person to provide that kindness. But she couldn't do it alone. The first person she thought of was Barron. She hesitated before dialing his number, her fingers trembling over the screen. What if he thought this was ridiculous? What if he had never expected her to reach out again? Taking a deep breath, she hit call. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Sarah?" His voice was quieter than she remembered, almost hesitant. "Hey, Barron," she said, forcing herself to speak before she lost her nerve. I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me, about the money." There was a brief silence on the other end, then Barron responded, "I told you it was yours to do whatever you wanted with. You don't have to explain yourself." Sarah let out a nervous laugh. "I know, but that's the thing. I don't want to just use it for myself. I want to do something that matters." Barron was quiet for a long moment before he finally asked, "What are you thinking?" Sarah took a deep breath and launched into her idea. A fund to help struggling families. A way to give back to the community. She told him about the people she had met in the diner over the years, the stories she had heard, and how sometimes even the smallest amount of help could mean everything. By the time she finished, she was breathless, her heart pounding. Barron was silent for so long that she feared she had overwhelmed him. Then, finally, he spoke. "That's incredible, Sarah." She blinked. "You think so?" "I know so," he said, his voice steady with certainty. "And if this is what you want to do, I want to help." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "I wasn't asking for more money, Barron." "I know," he interrupted. "And that's exactly why I want to help." She could hear something in his tone, something warm, something genuine. "You already gave me more than I could have ever asked for," she admitted softly. "I just didn't expect that what I really needed wasn't just the money. It was the belief that I could actually do something with it." "And that's what you gave me?" Barron chuckled lightly. "I think you gave that to yourself, Sarah. I just handed you a check." Sarah smiled to herself. It was more than that, and they both knew it. Barron promised to introduce her to people who could help guide her through the logistics of starting a community initiative. Lawyers, nonprofits, people who had done this kind of thing before. He made a few calls, setting up meetings, and soon enough, Sarah found herself standing in front of a team of people who genuinely wanted to help her bring her vision to life. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a purpose, beyond just making it through the day. The name of the fund came to her one afternoon as she sat in the diner on her break, staring out at the people passing by. She thought of Barron, of their conversation that night, of his unexpected kindness that had shifted the course of her life. The ripple effect, because that's what it was. A single act of generosity had rippled outward, touching her, and now she was sending those ripples even further, to people she hadn't even met yet, to people who were still struggling, who needed that one break, that one chance, the same way she had needed it. When she told Barron the name, he smiled. "That's perfect," he said. Within a few weeks, the Ripple Effect Fund was officially up and running. Sarah was overwhelmed by the number of people who came forward, single parents on the edge of losing their homes, young students barely scraping by, elderly people choosing between food and medication. Every application was a reminder of why this mattered, of how close she had been to being in their place just a few weeks ago. She used the $10,000 to kickstart the first round of assistance, giving directly to those who needed it most. But something unexpected happened. As people heard about what she was doing, they wanted to help too. Donations started coming in, small at first, $20, $50, but soon local businesses were reaching out, wanting to contribute. The fund was growing. And Sarah, for the first time in her life, felt like she was part of something bigger. One evening, as she sat on the floor of her tiny apartment, sorting through applications and checking the fund's progress, her phone buzzed with a text. "Barron, how's everything going?" Sarah smiled, shaking her head. He had checked in on her almost every day since they had started this. "Sarah, you really want to know?" "Barron, of course." She hesitated before replying, looking around at the pile of papers, the growing spreadsheet of people they had helped, the overwhelming sense of hope that filled her chest. "Sarah, I think we're actually making a difference." There was a pause before Barron's reply came through. "Barron, I never doubted it for a second." Sarah put her phone down, exhaling deeply. The girl who had once felt invisible, stuck in the cycle of barely getting by, had become someone who was changing lives. And it had all started with one moment, one conversation, one unexpected act of kindness. a single ripple in the water, spreading outward, reaching places neither she nor Barron had ever imagined. As the days passed, the Ripple Effect Fund continued to grow at an astonishing rate. Sarah had expected to help a handful of people, maybe a few dozen at most, but within weeks, the fund had already reached hundreds of applicants, and more people were reaching out every day. Some were families struggling to put food on the table. Others were young students on the verge of dropping out due to tuition costs. There were single parents drowning in medical bills, elderly individuals who had spent their lives working but were now forced to choose between rent and medicine. The stories were heartbreaking, and the sheer weight of it all made Sarah realize just how deep the struggles of everyday people ran. The impact of Barron's generosity had set something in motion that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, Sarah sat on the floor of her tiny apartment, surrounded by stacks of applications and receipts. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her, but she couldn't stop now. Every name, every story was a person, a real human being relying on this fund to help them survive. And the realization that she had the ability to make a difference pushed her forward despite the fatigue. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She barely glanced at it before reaching for a pen, ready to jot down more notes. But when she saw Barron's name on the screen, she paused, a small smile forming on her lips. "Barron, how's it going?" Sarah sighed, stretching her legs out before typing back. "Sarah, exhausting, overwhelming, amazing. I think I need more coffee than legally allowed." His response came almost instantly. "Barron, sounds like you're doing something right. But don't overwork yourself. You can't help people if you burn out." Sarah leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. It was strange how quickly Barron had become a constant presence in her life. What had started as a simple act of generosity had turned into something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. And now, he was checking in on her, making sure she wasn't carrying all of this on her own. She hesitated before typing her next message. "Sarah, how are you? You never really talk about yourself." There was a long pause before his response came. "Barrick, I'm figuring things out. Watching you do this, seeing the way people's lives are changing, it's helped me more than I expected." Sarah frowned slightly, rereading his words. There was something there, something deeper beneath the surface. But before she could respond, another message popped up. "Barron, want to meet up tomorrow? I want to see how everything's going in person." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before typing back. "Sarah, yeah, that would be great." The next day, they met at a quiet cafe, far from the media's eyes. Barron had always been careful about where they met, not wanting to turn their work into a spectacle. When she arrived, he was already seated in the corner, a coffee cup in front of him, his fingers tapping absently against the table. He looked up as she approached, offering her a small smile. "You look tired," he noted, his blue eyes scanning her face. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "You're not wrong. I think I've forgotten what sleep feels like." Barron's expression turned serious. "You know, you don't have to do this all on your own, right? We can find people to help you manage everything." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. And I will. It's just hard to let go. I want to make sure every single person gets the help they need." Barron leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's why I know you're the right person for this. You actually care." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. For so long, she had been fighting to survive, pushing forward without knowing if it even mattered. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. They spent the next hour going over the fund's progress, talking about ways to expand and bring in more support. But as the conversation went on, Sarah noticed something different in Barron. He was quieter than usual, more reserved. "Hey," she said softly. "What's going on? You've been checking in on me constantly, but I feel like you're the one who's struggling with something." Barron hesitated, glancing down at his coffee cup. For a moment she thought he might brush it off, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. You ever feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough? He asked. Sarah blinked at the question, caught off guard by the rawness in his voice. Of course, she admitted. All the time. But what makes you feel that way? Barron exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know. Maybe it's just growing up the way I did. People assume that just because I have money, my life has always been perfect. But it never felt like my own. Every move I make is watched. Every decision I make is analyzed. Sometimes I wonder if I even know who I really am. Sarah's heart ached at his words. She had seen the headlines, the speculation, the scrutiny that followed him wherever he went. But she had never thought about what it must have felt like. To live under that kind of pressure. To have his identity shaped by expectations he never agreed to. Barron, she said gently, you've already done more than most people would ever think to do. Look at what you started. Look at how many people's lives you've changed. If that's not enough, I don't know what is. He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. And what about you? She frowned. What about me? You were struggling too, he said quietly. You had every reason to use that money for yourself. But you didn't. You turned it into something bigger. Sarah smiled softly. I think we both needed something more than money, Barron. We needed a purpose. A slow smile spread across his lips. Yeah, maybe we did. They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation lingering between them. It was strange how life had brought them together. Two people from entirely different worlds, connected by an act of kindness that had changed both of their lives. After a while, Barron leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. You know what? I think I want to do more. Not just with this fund. I mean really get involved. Find a way to keep this going long term. Sarah grinned. That sounds like a plan. As they left the cafe, walking side by side down the rainy city streets, Sarah realized something. This wasn't just about helping others anymore. It was about finding themselves in the process. And that, she knew, was the most valuable gift of all. The days that followed were filled with an unstoppable momentum, as if the universe itself had aligned to push the Ripple Effect Fund beyond anything Sarah or Barron had imagined. Donations poured in from unexpected places, small contributions from everyday people who believed in their cause, and larger ones from philanthropists who had heard about the fund's impact. What had started as a single act of kindness had now turned into a movement, touching the lives of people across the country. Despite the success, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the weight of it all. She barely had time to breathe between responding to applicants, coordinating fund allocations, and organizing events to raise more awareness. It was exhilarating but exhausting. And through it all, Barron remained by her side. Not in the spotlight, not taking credit, but offering his quiet support, ensuring she never felt alone in this journey. One evening, Sarah sat in the small office they had set up for the fund, her desk littered with stacks of papers. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. The sound of a soft knock on the door startled her, and when she looked up, Barron was standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. You look like you haven't slept in days, he said, setting 1 cup in front of her before taking a seat across the desk. Sarah let out a tired laugh. Because I haven't. There's just so much to do, so many people to help. I don't want to miss anything. Barron studied her for a moment before leaning forward. You're doing an incredible job, but you can't do this alone. We need to find more people to help run the fund. It's growing too fast for just the 2 of us. Sarah sighed, knowing he was right. I know, but it's hard to let go. I want to make sure everything stays real, that it doesn't turn into one of those organizations where the people who need help the most get lost in the system. Barron nodded, understanding her fear. That's exactly why we need the right people. We can't let this collapse under its own weight. Sarah looked at him, realizing how much they had both changed in the past few months. When they had first met, she had seen him as nothing more than a rich kid, someone whose problems couldn't possibly compare to hers. But now she knew the truth. Barron carried his own burdens, his own struggles with identity and purpose, and somehow they had found a way to lift each other up. "All right," she said finally, sipping her coffee. "We'll start looking for a team." A few days later, they held their first meeting with potential advisors, people who had experience in nonprofit management, fundraising, and outreach. Sarah was nervous, afraid of losing control over the vision she had built from the ground up. But as she listened to them speak, she realized something important. She didn't have to do this alone. After the meeting, she and Barron stepped outside into the crisp evening air. "You did good in there," Barron said, nudging her shoulder playfully. "Took a big step." Sarah smiled. "I guess I'm starting to trust the process." Barron chuckled. "That's all we can do." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Then Barron turned to her, his expression more serious. "Sarah, have you thought about what comes next? For you, I mean?" Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been doing this non-stop, but is this all you want? Do you have any dreams for yourself beyond this fund?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so consumed with helping others that she hadn't stopped to think about herself. For so long, her only goal had been survival, paying the bills, keeping food on the table, making it to the next month. But now, she hesitated. I don't know. I think, for the first time, I feel like I have a purpose, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Barron nodded slowly. "I get that, but I also want you to have something that's just for you." Sarah looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about the fund. He was talking about her future beyond this mission they had built together. And in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't just doing this for others. She was doing this for herself, too. "I think I want to keep going," she said finally, "but maybe in a way that allows me to have a life, too." Barron smiled. "Good, because you deserve that." They stood there for a while, the weight of the moment settling between them. It wasn't just about the fund anymore. It was about what came next, for both of them. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was finally beginning to see the answer. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to embrace the balance between running the Ripple Effect Fund and living a life she had never thought possible. The organization continued to grow, but this time she wasn't carrying the weight alone. A small but dedicated team had joined her mission, and for the first time, she allowed herself to trust that others could help maintain the vision. The fund had transformed from a single act of kindness into a movement that had touched countless lives. And with it, Sarah found a new sense of confidence in herself. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Sarah walked out of the office to find Barron sitting on a bench outside, watching the sun set over the city skyline. The golden hues reflected off the buildings, casting everything in a warm glow. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs, before sitting beside him. "You know," Barron said, glancing at her with a small smile, "I think this might be the first time I've seen you look at peace." Sarah laughed softly. "I think this might be the first time I've felt at peace." Barron nodded as if he already knew. "You built something incredible, Sarah. You should be proud." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. He looked lighter, as if some unseen burden had lifted from his shoulders. The same young man who had once walked into the diner, lost and searching for something he couldn't name, now sat beside her with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. "Barron," she started, hesitating, "what about you? What comes next for you?" He exhaled slowly, leaning back against the bench. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to have all the answers, and that's freeing." Sarah smiled. "You don't have to save the world overnight." Barron chuckled. "Neither do you." A comfortable silence settled between them as the sun dipped lower in the sky. There was an understanding now, one that didn't need to be spoken aloud. They had both changed. They had both grown, and in some strange way, they had saved each other. As Sarah gazed at the horizon, she thought back to the night Barron had first walked into the diner. She had no idea then how much her life was about to change, that a simple encounter with a stranger would lead to something so much bigger than herself. And yet, here they were. She turned to Barron, her heart full. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. Barron met her gaze, a knowing look in his eyes. "No, Sarah. Thank you." And as the city lights flickered to life, they both knew this was just the beginning of something greater than either of them had ever imagined. This story reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples far beyond what we can imagine. Barron Trump's unexpected generosity changed Sarah's life, but in the end it was about much more than money. It was about connection, hope, and the power of believing in someone. In today's fast-pacing world, it's easy to feel invisible, to believe that our struggles go unnoticed. But as this story shows, sometimes all it takes is one person to see us, to remind us that we are not alone. What if we all chose to be that person for someone else? Imagine the impact. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives of kindness and resilience. Let's keep the ripple of generosity going, because together we can make the world a little brighter, one act of compassion at a time.